In this lecture, you'll learn how we can use game configuration data from a file in a Unity game. So let's go right to a game that does that. This is my configuration data comma-separated value file. The first line in my file has the name of each of the values for the configuration data, and the second line has the values for those values. So this is the format of my CSV file. Obviously, this is fairly difficult to read, and it's a little nicer if we open it up in Excel instead of in Notepad++, but I'd need to expand each of these columns to make it readable, and at that point I still have to scroll left and right. But this is a pretty basic format that we're going to use for the CSV file for this particular lecture. And the way the game works is I drive my burger around shooting French fries at teddy bears, and I'm feeding them, but actually I'm killing them because they've overeaten the French fries. So that's the actual game that we're playing. We'll look at this game in a lot more detail when we do the Feed the Teddies lesson. Let's take a look at the code we use to implement using the configuration data in that CSV file that I showed you. The first class we'll look at is the configuration data class, and this is really just a container for all the configuration data. It will retrieve that data from the file and hold it so that other classes can actually access the data. I have a field here for the configuration data file name, and then I have fields for each of those configuration data values, and when I declare each of those fields, I assign a default value as well. And the reason I do that is because if I fail reading the data from the file, I'll still have data available to the rest of the game. It will be the default data, not data from a configuration data file, but at least there'll be some data that the game can use to actually run. So here are fields for all those configuration data values, and then I expose a property for each of those fields. So obviously public, and the teddy bear projectile impulse force is afloat, and I provide read access or get accessors for each of these fields. Nobody can change these fields. They're contained here in this configuration data class, and no one else can change them, but they can in fact find out what they are. So I have properties for all of those fields, and then down near the bottom of my class I have the constructor, and the constructor will use a stream reader to read in the configuration data, and a CSV file is just a text file that has the format that the values are separated by commas. So I can open the stream reader using OpenText like we've seen before. What's new here is that we're going to use something called path combine to actually combine the streaming assets path for the application with the configuration data file name I have. The reason I'm doing this is because if we put that CSV file into a folder called streaming assets in our Unity project, we don't have to hard code anything. Unity will figure out where it is, and that will work whether we're working in the editor or in a built game. So this is a best practice for having files. We want to put them in streaming assets and use this mechanism, the combine method in the path class, to combine that streaming assets folder with whatever the file name is. I do a read line to read in all the names of the configuration data. In this implementation, I'm just throwing that line away, but I do need to read in the next line, which is the values, so I do that and put the resulting string into my values variable here. Then I call a setConfigurationDataFields method that we'll look at soon. If any of this goes wrong, this is why we learned about exception handling. If anything throws an exception in all of this, we'll catch it here. And then we have a finally block so that we will close our input file if it's not null. If we failed when we tried to open our input file, then input right here is null, and we'd get a null reference exception here when we tried to call the close method. So if in fact we did open the input file, we want to close it here. In the setConfigurationDataFields method, we pass in that string of comma-separated values, which I've called CSV values. And the first thing we do is we call the split method on that string, splitting it on the comma character. So what happens is each of the values that is separated by commas gets put into this values array. So this split method is really helpful when we want to process comma-separated value strings. We do assume we know the order in which the values appear. And there are more robust ways that we'll actually see when we look at the full implementation of the Feed the Teddies game. But in this simple implementation, we're assuming we know what order those values are in the file. So we're assuming teddy bear projectile impulse force comes first, and then projectile damage, and so on. All we do is we parse each of the values in the array into the appropriate data type and put it into the corresponding field. So this is where we're actually populating the values of the fields with the values that are in that CSV string. So if we're lucky, we get to do all of this stuff and no exceptions get thrown, and all of our fields will hold the values that were actually in the file. I mentioned that we expose properties for classes that want to actually access the state of the configuration data object, and there's really only one class that does that. I have a configuration utils class that's a static class, and the reason I'm doing it this way is because I don't want every object in the game that needs to access configuration data to have to carry around a configuration data object. Instead, I'm providing this utility class that will let everybody get all that information just by accessing properties in the configuration utils class. So this class will hold a configuration data object, and it will provide all the same exact properties that configuration data does, except through static properties. And as you can see, all it does is it wraps the property that's exposed by the configuration data object. And this makes it so that all the other objects in the game only need to know about configuration utils when they need to access something. So we have all those properties. And I'll show you one example of a different class accessing a property. So in our burger class, when the burger is about to move, it actually gets the burger move units per second from configuration utils. And if we choose to tune that value, we can just change the value in our CSV file without touching source code. And then we'll read it in from the file into configuration data, and configuration utils will wrap that property and provide access here to the burger class. The last thing we need to do in configuration utils is create a configuration data object, and we do that in this initialize method. So we just use the standard C# constructor for constructing a configuration data object, which means that somebody has to call this initialize method. And if we find all references, we can see that one class does that, a game initializer class that I wrote, in an awake method. So the awake method is called before any start methods are called, and this will make sure that the configuration utils, and by extension the configuration data, is actually read in from the file and all set up before any game object runs any start methods. We'd like to make sure this is initialized before any of that other stuff happens. So we just call configuration utils.initialize, which over here creates our configuration data object, which, as we saw when we looked at the constructor of the configuration data object, goes and opens the file and reads in the values and parses them into the fields and so on. And that's how we can use configuration data in a Unity game. To recap, in this lecture you learned that it's pretty straightforward to use game configuration data from a file in a Unity game. I'll remind you that we should hide the fact that that data comes from a file in a single class, so that none of the other classes in our game have to care where configuration data comes from.